Thank you all for your patience. Am I audible without a mic? Yeah? Okay, great. So welcome. My name is Adam Late. I'm the chair of the IU Philosophy Department, and it is my pleasure to introduce this year's annual Bo and Lynn Clark Memorial Lecture. I want to begin by telling you a little bit about Romaine Clark, who is a member of our department and known as Bo. Bo received his bachelor's and PhD degrees in philosophy from the State University of Iowa, where he was a student from the mid-1940s until 1952, when the Iowa faculty included luminaries such as Gustav Bergman, a member of the Vienna Circle, and Wilfrid Sellars, among others. His first faculty position was at Duke University. In 1970, he moved to IU, where he remained until his retirement in 1991. He served as chair of the IU Philosophy Department from 1972 to 1974. Bo Clark was interested in the philosophy of perception, the structure of natural language, and the nature of common patterns of inference in everyday reasoning. His work was well respected, as shown in part by the prestigious fellowships and grants he received, including an NEH fellowship and grants from the Fulbright Foundation and from the NSF. He was a dedicated teacher who supervised many graduate dissertations. He was also widely admired and respected by his colleagues. Paul Spade, who was Bo's colleague in the IU Philosophy Department for 20 years, and who many of you know, wrote in 2008 as follows. He said, "Bo was an acute philosopher and one of the few philosophers I've known whose work everyone who knew him respected. No one thought he was crazy, pursuing marginal and uninteresting topics, or that he did sloppy or question-begging work. He always asked the most penetrating questions in departmental colloquia and papers, ones that clarified issues for everyone, and went right to the heart of the matter. He was also a man of utmost honesty and just plain good sense." There's a member of the Clark family with us today, and I spoke a little earlier with her, and she shared some observations about Bo. She said he was gentle, observant, a consummate host, and he made an excellent whiskey sour. So Bo and his wife Lynn had 4 children, Carolee Hawkins and Kathleen John and Ron Clark. They have generously given money to the IU Philosophy Department in memory of their parents, both to fund the annual Bo and Lynn Clark lectures, and also to fund 3 annual prizes for philosophy graduate students, 2 for excellence in philosophical writing, and 1 for excellence in teaching. We are deeply, deeply grateful for their continuing support of the IU Philosophy Department in all of these ways. Today's Clark Memorial Lecturer is Shannon Spaulding. Professor Spaulding is an associate professor at Oklahoma State University. She received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and did a postdoctoral research fellowship in the Philosophy, Neuroscience, Psychology program at Washington University in St. Louis. She specializes in philosophical issues related to cognitive science, philosophy of psychology, and general philosophy of science. Her main overall focus is on social cognition, with projects on empathy, the relationship between trust and perspective taking, and the cognitive structure of implicit bias. She has published some 38 articles and book chapters, and a 2018 book, How We Understand Others, Philosophy and Social Cognition. As an undergraduate at Texas Tech, Professor Spaulding was a serious athlete in cross-country and track and field, as well as a philosophy major. She received All-American and Academic All-American honors in the NCAA and placed 6th in the 800 meters in the US Championships in 2002. This is the sort of thing I have never gotten to say. You know, it's really exciting.
The Q&A will just be a foot race.
So
we'll all lose.
in a biography on her webpage, she wrote, "After completing my NCAA eligibility and my MA degree, I decided to trade one bad job market, running, for another bad job market, philosophy. and I applied to philosophy PhD programs. Now, it seems that she made a very good choice. So her talk today is on trust and empathy. After the talk, we'll have a brief break and then reconvene for questions, after which we hope that you will join us for a reception in the next room over. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Spaulding.
Thank you for the warm welcome. I assume my microphone is on. Ready to do anything to make sure that it's on?
Is there a red light or a green light?
There are no lights. Okay. So there it is. Graduate school did not prepare me for trying out. Okay, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I got into this project as a way of motivating the talk and the paper itself. So I've been thinking about empathy for a long time. A number of years I've been focused on the cognitive processes that underlie our interactions with other people. And I've been interested in the ways in which we misunderstand other people. Like, what are the impediments to understanding somebody's mental states? And I focus a bit on stereotypes and biases, but also the goals that motivate our social interactions. And I came to some of the discussion of the critiques of empathy, which some of you may be familiar with, through the lens of this social cognition, right? Trying to think about how we understand and misunderstand other people. So some of the critiques of empathy, well, let me just say what empathy is just briefly. Empathy is trying to understand other people's perspectives, trying to understand what it feels like to be another person. So empathy, many people think, many people have said, is a useful tool for overcoming partisanship and division, because in reality, how are you going to overcome partisanship and division if you don't try to take somebody's perspective, to feel what it is like to have their lived experiences, to humanize people in this way? The critiques of empathy are from figures like Fritz Breithaupt, of course, Jesse Prince and Paul Bloom. And though they have different takes and different positive views, there are some commonalities there. What they suggest is that empathy sometimes fails as a social and moral decision-making tool because we don't empathize with the people who most need it, right? We kind of withhold empathy in some cases. We empathize often with people who are on our side of a conflict. Okay? So in the case where we would most need empathy, we are not using it productively. We're using it more for affiliation purposes. And empathy is fragile. It's exhausting to empathize with people, especially people who really need our empathy. Right, so we saw this in the COVID-19 pandemic, where healthcare workers or people in social services more generally, teachers, educators, were experiencing this empathy burnout, right? Trying to relate to their students and their patients. And it was just really difficult, which of course, burnout leads to job turnover, which leads to less kind of consistency and worse patient care and worse teaching. Okay, background there. So I was trying to understand these critiques of empathy as a poor social and moral decision-making tool. And what I kept noticing was that in lots of cases where there is a lack of empathy, there's also a lack of trust, and perhaps even a bit of distrust. And so I kept trying to figure out what really is the relationship between trust and empathy. So one question, or I guess two questions that kept coming to mind for me is, when you distrust somebody, can you get yourself to empathize with them? That is, see the world from their perspective and see the reasonableness of their perspective. And it seems difficult, perhaps not impossible, but difficult, because part of what the distrust does is question their experiences, question their take on the world, And so the other question that kept coming up for me is that when you can't empathize with somebody, you find it very difficult to see the world from a perspective, or find it difficult to find that perspective reasonable in any way. Can you get yourself to trust that person? And that also seems really difficult. And so what I was trying to think of is like, how are these things connected? How are trust and empathy related to each other? Another tidbit that kind of put me on this path was these sociological findings that show a decrease in empathy over time. And this is across Western democracies. So from, I think the decrease started in the 50s and 60s. There's a pretty steady decline, but up until around year 2000, then you start to get this very steady, this steep decline. Affective polarization, which is disliking and distrusting others from who have different viewpoints, social political viewpoints and values, it's got the same path. Right, so it's showing a steady increase until about the year 2000, and then it shows a spiking. So at this kind of social level, the sociological level, we are seeing some, correlations in the patterns of trust and or distrust and a lack of empathy. And it seems, at least at an intuitive level, there are psychological connections between trust and empathy, such that when you trust somebody, it's easier to empathize with them, and vice versa. And when you just distrust somebody, it's harder to empathize with them, and vice versa. So this is the kind of motivation for the project, is to figure out what really is the relationship. And so I want to suggest that there is, well, it's a Venn diagram. So there's lots of different cases here that you could populate the Venn diagram with. I'm most interested in the cases outside the circles. That is, I'm most interested in the cases where people mistrust each other and don't empathize with each other, because I'm most interested in figuring out how you can break in to that cycle. So clearly there are cases where individuals can trust somebody without empathizing with them. So children trust their parents, but they don't empathize with them. Adults who are especially dependent on caretakers, or maybe especially codependent with their partners, they can trust without empathizing. You can have empathy without trust, right? So you can imagine empathizing with somebody who's in a state of crisis, right? Or somebody who's experiencing a manic episode. You can empathize with them, but you certainly don't trust them. Or perhaps we'll talk about this later in the talk, fictional characters. You can empathize with fictional characters, but there's not really a sense in which you trust them, maybe not directly. And of course, outside of the circles, there are people that you're just apathetic toward, right? So you either trust or empathize with them, but not because there is any antipathy here. I was looking for a word that is like where you don't empathize with somebody, and antipathy needs to be the word. It's not the right word. It doesn't fit, but antipathy needs to be the word. We have distrust and we have lack of empathy, and there really should be empathy, but for some reason there's not a single word for this. I'm sure there is in German, so if somebody can tell me if that works. Okay, so what I'm most interested in is the case where you distrust and you find it difficult or impossible to empathize with. And the question I want to ask is, how can you break into those cases? And the reason why I want to ask this question is because I think this characterizes a lot of social and political discourse, where you have this affective polarization and you have the lack of trust and the lack of empathy. And so the question I want to ask is like, can you break in, and how can you break in? So that's the project for today. Okay, so here's my outline for the talk. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I mean by trust. I'll talk about distrust across these cases of polarization and experiential divides. I'll talk about the connection between empathy and trust, and then suggest that empathy might be the kind of way through these cases of polarization. as opposed to trust. Okay. So figuring out who to trust and who to trust is incredibly important as a social species, of course. When you imprudently trust somebody, you risk financial disaster, you risk personal betrayal, you risk a lot of negative consequences. So it's really important that we learn who are the trustworthy people to figure out who to invest our life's fortunes with. But it's also really important to figure out who is not trustworthy. So this is a perennial issue for us to figure out who can be trusted with their children, who can be trusted with their secrets, who can be trusted with money, these sorts of things. So if you're overly trustworthy, you're going to fall prey to scammers and snake oil salesmen and all the like. But if you're overly distrusting, right, that's problematic too. When you're overly distrusting, it's really difficult to get long-term projects off the ground because long-term projects require that you make short-term sacrifices for long-term gains. So that kind of trust is essential for any long-term project. And as a society, just sort of scaling up a little bit, it's really difficult to have any projects that require sacrifices of people if there's no trust institutionally or no trust of individual people. So learning who to trust is important, learning who to distrust is important, and allocating that appropriately is also important. So I want to suggest that distrust is particularly challenging in this situation. So imagine that you trust an individual to, I don't know, take care of your kids. And the trust is potentially built up over a long period of time, typically it is. And somebody fails to show up when they say they're going to watch your kids, right? You trust that person, so you give them a bit of grace, right? And if they continually fail to show up, you might kind of pull back on that trust. So it's not that it's impossible to lose trust in somebody, but because you trust them, you thereby give them the benefit of the doubt. That's part of what trusting involves, assuming they have some level of confidence and appropriate motivation. So trust can be dismantled, but it's it takes a little bit of work. Distrust is really hard to disrupt because distrust involves thinking poorly of somebody's epistemic abilities or thinking poorly of somebody's motivations. And so when you have that assumption, so not just a lack of trust, but an actual distrust in these cases, it's really hard for any evidence to shift your perspective when you distrust somebody. So there's a bit of confirmation bias built into your interpretation of their behavior. Even when there's something that seems pretty benign, you might think of this as an outlier example, or perhaps there's an underlying motivation. So I think there is a bit of difficulty when distrust is there. So I'm not going to suggest that we are massively mistaken in how we allocate our trust and distrust. We do have robust epistemic vigilance mechanisms that help us figure out who is trustworthy and who is not trustworthy. These are mechanisms that have evolved across the millennia, and they are particularly helpful, but they are particularly helpful in face-to-face interactions. And when we are not primarily engaged in face-to-face interactions, these epistemic vigilance mechanisms are not nearly as effective. And so what I want to suggest is that a lot of the polarization, a lot of the integrated conflict that we currently face is at least partially a result of the fact that our information that we get in our interactions are not the kind where our epistemic vigilance mechanisms would be all that effective. And so we are not very good at figuring out who is trustworthy and who is not trustworthy in these alternative information environments that we are often now in. So as a result, I think what often happens is that we are trusting inappropriately and distrusting inappropriately, especially along social political divides. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what I mean by trust and distrust. So imagine, I was trouble coming up with a good example of when you trust somebody. So when I first gave this talk, I used an example of a plumber, but I just don't trust any of my customers. Like none of my plumbers have revealed themselves to be trustworthy. And then I thought, I'll use a dentist. And it's still not the case. Like I can't find a good practical example of where I actually do trust somebody. But suppose that you, like Bloomington has amazing dentists and you guys are just wowed by them. So I'm going to talk about trust in this three-place fashion, right? So X distrust Y with respect to Z. So there is the possibility that somebody can trust another person just full stop. I think that trust is pretty rare. And maybe it's like for children who, or others who don't have the capacity to discriminate more finely. I have a hunch that this is all there is, that nobody actually really trusts somebody fully, but it's not, nothing in the talk hinges on that. So I'm going to talk about this in this three-place way. So X trust Y with respect to Z. And what does that mean? What does the trusting or distrusting mean? It means you have some background belief about their competence. So when you trust your dentist, or when I distrust mine, part of what you might be saying is that I think that they are competent to identify dental problems, right? I think that they're good at it. They are, not that they're perfect, but they're fairly reliable and good at it. But also, you're also committing yourself to some belief about their motivations. So in the dental case, this is where I can't tell whether I fall off on the confidence of the motivation, usually the motivation. So when you trust your dentist, not only do you think that they can correctly identify cavities or correctly or appropriately prescribe a root canal, but they're also motivated to help you. They're not motivated by, I don't know, prescribing interventions that bring about more money for them, something. And when I distrust my dentist with respect to identifying cavities, for example, I might think that they are competent in one case, but I might not trust their motivations. So this view that there's lots of different views of trust out there. The view that I'm adopting is probably closest to the motivation-based view of Annette Baer or Cloud. So one last important thing here and distinction is that on the view that I'm adopting, there's a distinction between trust and reliance. So you can rely on somebody. I can rely on my dentist, but not trust them. And what does that mean? So for example, suppose I rely on my dentist to identify cavities, but when my dentist says that I need a root canal, I might seek a second opinion. I don't really trust my dentist in that case. Perhaps because I have suspicions about one of these things falling through. When you're relying on somebody, I think what you get is kind of assumption about their competence, probably. But maybe you're ambivalent about their motivation, or vice versa. You might be ambivalent about their competence, but think that they've got the right motives, but who knows whether they've got it right. So I'm specifically talking about trust. And the difference between trust and reliance is that trust can be betrayed. And reliance, perhaps it's disappointed, but there's no effective response there, right? There's no kind of betrayal that happens when somebody disappoints you. When you're relying on them and they didn't show, you might be annoyed, right? You might be irritated, but you're not betrayed. And so it's the betrayal, this kind of affective component of trust that I am interested in here. So this is going to come up later, so just remember. Okay, So there's one last distinction here is between pragmatic trust and epistemic trust. Pragmatic trust is when you trust, like the dentist case, you trust them to do something. I trust my dentist to correctly identify cavities. And epistemic trust is trusting somebody's judgment, trusting their testimony, trusting their assessments of a situation. We'll talk about both, but in the cases I'm most interested in, epistemic trust is most important. Okay. So of course you can have, so suppose you trust somebody epistemically and they violate your trust. The betrayal in that case looks like you kind of realizing that they lied to you, right? Feeling of betrayal in that sense, or realizing that you mistrusted them. In the pragmatic case, it's like they disappoint if you suppose you trusted your dentist, realizing that all along they were poorly motivated, or all along, you sort of fell for a scam. They really didn't know what they were doing. Okay, so again, I want to just kind of prime your memories of the Venn diagram I had up before with trust and empathy, and remind you that what I'm really interested in is the kind of outskirts of the Venn diagram, where you have neither a lack of trust, or rather, sorry, you have neither trust nor empathy, and how in those cases do you break in? Okay, so I want to think of a concrete example to help us along here, where you have these vast gaps in experience between two people. So you can choose your favorite example. I'll just use one. So imagine a cisgender individual encountering a transgender individual, and they have these radically different experiences in their social worlds. They have these experience gaps, is what I'll say. And you can have different responses to these experience gaps. So you can imagine the cisgender individual responding to the transgender individual with just curiosity. Like, what is your life like? Let me hear about these things. How did you come to know that this was true of you? That is certainly the case, that sometimes people respond to these experience gaps with curiosity. You can imagine that somebody feels uncomfortable with the situation, and so what they adopt really is a stance of strategic apathy. Right? So just not engaging at all, not with a response of distrusting and disliking, but just with a kind of apathy. So the last response is what I'm most interested in, is when you have these cases where you have vastly different lived experiences. You can adopt different sorts of examples here, really different values, really different beliefs, really different political ideas for these sorts of cases too. Where your response to these differences is a response of distrust. And these are the cases where you get affective polarization and conflict. So this isn't a diagnosis of every case of affective polarization, or even the most relevant kind of cause of affective polarization. Surely there's a case for political propaganda here, of manipulating news, so I do not want to deny that there are other factors involved here. But I'm particularly interested in how, in virtue of encountering somebody who has these different lived experiences or values or beliefs or just habits, really, just kind of ways of living, you can develop this kind of distrust. Because I think that what the data is telling us is that it's happening quite a lot, right? So even more than, say, 20 to 30 years ago, people are reporting that they would feel extremely disappointed if their children married somebody of a different religion or married somebody of a different political party than their own, right? So these are sorts of cases where they have a standing distrust of somebody who doesn't share their core ideologies. And so I think that this does, in fact, happen. It's not the only cause of polarization and conflict, but it is a real one. Okay. So in these cases of polarization and conflict, distrust is baked into the phenomenon. So polarization is distrusting and disliking somebody who has a different political persuasion than you. That is sort of the definition of it. But interestingly, a lack of empathy is baked into the phenomenon as well. So when you have this dislike and distrust of people who have a different political persuasion than you, or different ideologies or different experiences, part of what's going on is that you find it difficult to imagine being them. You find it difficult that to imagine that their perspective is reasonable. You find it difficult to see how you could come to that perspective. So a lack of empathy is, I think, part of the equation here. And they reinforce each other. So the fact that we have a hard time taking their perspective lends credence to the idea that they're not trustworthy. Right? If I can't make sense of something, then there's no sense to be made of it. If I can't make sense of it, then I don't trust it. So I know philosophers think that way, but I think normal people think that way too, right? Where if it's not sensible to you, then it's not to be trusted. Okay, so this makes interrupting polarization and conflict especially problematic and difficult. Okay, so we have a solution that has been offered from several folks. So Olivia Bailey is one of these folks. Catherine Tolman is another person who has a similar solution here. So both Tolman and Bailey look at these cases where you have these vast experiential divides between people. And what they suggest is that we shouldn't even try to empathize in these cases. So again, take the concrete case I had before, which was a cisgender individual encountering a transgender individual whose lived experiences are just radically different from the cisgender individual. So different that it might be hard to really take their perspective, right? To feel what it's like, not just to, you know, do this kind of affect-less, like perspective taking where I figure out what somebody's beliefs and desires are, but like how something makes like real empathy, like how something makes you feel, right? So what Bailey suggests is that we're never going to get this right. Empathizing across these wide experience gaps is just bound to fail. So why is it bound to fail on her view? She argues that we cannot properly mentally simulate others' emotions, but in particular, the emotional appraisals that are built into the emotions. So when I'm having some emotional experience, it's not just, you know, the affects that I'm experiencing. On what Bailey's suggesting is that, at least for many emotional experiences, there's an implicit appraisal of your emotion as appropriate to what you are reacting to. Now, of course, on reflection, you might think that like, well, I was just hungry, or that's often what it is for me. Or, you know, that was inappropriate, or I should have responded with a cooler head. But in the moment, in the experience of it, the actual experience, there is this emotional appraisal built into it. And so what Bailey suggests is that in these cases where you have these vast experiential divides, you can't get the appraisal right. Right? What you get is maybe a rough approximation of what they're feeling, right? A label for what they're feeling, but it doesn't seem appropriate to you, right? It's still kind of, it still seems off to you. So what you will never do really is understand what it's like to experience what that person is experiencing, experience the emotions that they are experiencing. Now, I want to be careful here. She's not suggesting that we can never know what it's like we can never understand what it's like for any other person. She does think that empathy amongst friends and family members can be successful, and in fact generates what she calls humane understanding. But it's empathy across these divides where she thinks we are going to make mistakes, This will generate a false feeling of understanding on the part of the empathizer and frustration on the part of the person being empathized with because they are not actually being understood. So really what she's suggesting is don't try to empathize with other people. Instead, just trust their testimony. Right? So when somebody says to you, that was a menacing stare, I was not safe in that environment. And you try to kind of adopt their perspective and you think like, was it? Was it really? It seems fine to me, actually. And her diagnosis here is that we're just not capable of empathizing across these divides. And instead of trying to understand why this person felt unsafe and why that stare felt menacing to this person, should believe them, should just trust them. Instead, this is the way in. So when I asked, when we have these cases where you lack trust and you lack empathy, is there a way to break in and what is that way? Her suggestion is not through empathy, it's through trust. Okay. So when you trust somebody, not just rely on them, when you're trusting them, and in this case, this is the epistemic trust rather than pragmatic trust. When you're trusting somebody, that requires setting aside any purported counter evidence that you have in your possession. So if somebody says to you, actually that situation was totally fine. I felt fine, everybody else felt fine, it was good. If you're trusting this person, it requires setting those things aside, right? And of course, you're gonna have to weigh evidence if you trust both people, and then you're in a pickle. But trusting them is not a simple prospect in the case where you don't have the same experiences. Okay, so this is a really bold argument. So what I want to suggest is that this bold argument is wrong. And one of the things I want to argue is that there's a difference between capturing the emotional appraisal, which may be difficult in some cases, and endorsing what somebody is feeling as kind of appropriate or as fitting to the situation. I think that we can, in fact, capture the emotional appraisal in people's affective experiences and quarantine those, right? So just to preview what I'm going to argue later, we do this all the time in fiction, right? So when I am reading Othello, right, and I am empathizing with Othello, well, like a straight version of reading Othello, if I just gave you like the student version, the Cliff Notes, right, it sounds just like a domestic abuse story. Right? I mean, it's much more than that. It's not just a domestic abuse story. It's not, a Lifetime movie. But I can, in this case, even though I am not, part of an honor culture society, even though I am not living back in the 1600s, even though I have my own perspectives on what's appropriate to do when you are jealous and what's appropriate to do when somebody has cheated on you, I can quarantine those things in the case of fiction, right? I can appropriately get myself to this mental simulation of Othello's state where it feels like he has no other option to save his honor than to murder his wife, right? Even though I think like that's an overreaction to the situation on the ground. So I can quarantine my own thoughts and perspectives in these cases from the emotional appraisal. And that I think is not appropriately reflected in Bailey's arguments here. The other part I want to point out is that trust without understanding is especially fragile. And I'm not sure that it even counts as trust at all. So imagine that in this case, you were asked to trust the person who says that the stare is menacing or that the situation was unsafe for them, but you don't understand how it could be. that's a sort of trust that I think is going to break down under just any sort of pressure. And I'm not entirely sure that trusting somebody without understanding their epistemic competence to evaluate this, or understanding their motivations, is really a sort of trust that is worth the name. So the other suggestion I'm making here is that even if this were the path forward, I don't think that this would be a better path, because the trust would falter very quickly. Now, there is a bit of a difficulty here in avoiding the trust but verify oxymoron, right? So what Bailey argues is that if you have to verify somebody's information, if you have to be able to take their perspective, to empathize with them in order to believe them, you're not really trusting, you're just gathering your own data, right? So if you were to truly trust them, you would just trust them, right? You wouldn't have to verify this information for yourself. I think there's a way forward here, and I think it's, trust is grounded in some assumptions about people, and I think you can ground the trust without constantly, every time somebody says something, trying to verify. So I think there's a way around that, but we can talk more about that in the Q&A if that's interesting to you guys. Okay, so on the view that I'm suggesting here, trust requires believing that a target is competent and properly motivated, part of the idea here. And in that way, I think that trust is often built on empathy. Not always, right? There are cases where you can have trust without empathy and empathy without trust. But as I suggested before, often when you trust people, it's easier to empathize with them. And when you can empathize with people, it's easier to trust them. So because trust is built on empathy, I think that empathy is a much more promising way through some of these divides. Okay. So let me just say, since I've said the word empathy about 60 times, what I mean by empathy at this point. I think this is not an idiosyncratic definition or conception of empathy, but as some have remarked, there's many, many, many conceptions. Yeah. So on the view that I find most compelling, there are two individually necessary and jointly sufficient components of empathy. The first is perspective taking, that is figuring out what somebody's beliefs, desires, mental states, emotions are. And the other part is affect sharing, that is coming to experience those things because the other person experiences them. So you need both, right? So if you are coming to experience, if you're just affect sharing, coming to experience something because somebody else is experiencing it, it could simply be emotional contagion, right? Where you're just kind of absorbing somebody's emotions without really empathizing. So you need both affect sharing and perspective taking. You need affect sharing in addition to perspective taking, because without the affect sharing components, you get a lot of kind of other oriented responses, but they're not really empathy, right? These are things that sympathy doesn't involve affect sharing or compassion. Or you can care about people from a distance, you can care about them without feeling what they feel. So this is the conception of empathy I'm working with. And just like trust is three place, empathy is typically three places as well, right? You empathize with particular experiences. Okay. So kind of moving forward, I probably won't say that much more, but I do want to clarify that both empathy and trust are for particular experiences. Okay, so what does empathy get you in terms of building trust and in terms of interrupting conflict and polarization? So a couple things that empathy does. I'll break this down into the two components of empathy, the perspective taking and then the affect sharing. So perspective taking gets you the capacity to understand the target's motivations. That's the job of perspective taking, which leads to you coming to a belief about their epistemic competence. I think this is pretty straightforward, so I won't belabor the point. But what it also gets you, perspective taking gets you, is an alternative to stereotypical explanations. So as I said before, I'm really interested in the cases of polarization and conflict where the beliefs you have about other people, the distrust you have in other people is not grounded in operative epistemic vigilance mechanisms, kind of saying that this person's not trustworthy or what have you. These are really cases where it's people like them versus people like us, right? These are the sorts of cases I'm interested in. And in that sort of situation, what empathy gets you is at least an alternative possibility of an explanation, right? So what you get is a way to understand their behavior that is not just within the kind of stereotypical bounds that you had previous to trying to understand the perspective. And then finally, what perspective taking gives you is some possibility for common ground. This is sort of what does the magic here for perspective taking. It reveals to you that this person who seems really difficult to understand at the outset actually has some core values. They might have some different beliefs and different values as well, but there's a lot of common ground that is not obvious on the outside. So one example that I think works well to illustrate this is imagine that you have an anti-vaxxer parent and then a vaxxer parent. I don't know, like the other case. So you might imagine, so I'll just say I vaccinate my children. They're up to date on all their vaccines. And I encounter a mother who is an anti-vaxxer. And my initial response is like, wow, read some science. Or like your risk reward ratio is really off here. Or I'm sure, there's all these assumptions about what other things she believes and what other things she feeds her children and what other things that she's willing to risk. But when I talk to that parent, what I actually recognize, when I try to understand from her perspective, what I actually realize is that she loves her kids just as much as I do. And in the midst of trying to understand scientific information that she is not qualified to truly assess, and honestly, I'm a philosopher, neither am I, right? I'm just accepting certain sources of information over the others. She's trying to make the best decision she knows how, and she is worried about the effects of the vaccines being too negative to warrant the effect, right? So she thinks like, well, do I want to vaccinate my kids against measles? No, measles are out, right? So is the short-term pain of this going to be worth the long-term effect? So, I mean, there's some differences here. There's, again, propaganda involved here. That's part of this as well. But really, it's a parent trying to make the best decision for kids that she loves. And so what perspective taking does is reveal that actually there's some differences, of course, but there is a lot of common ground here. And what it in fact does is reveal to you the most productive ways to have a conversation. Because the productive ways aren't the ways I started with, which is like, why don't you read some science? Because girl, you need to read some science too, right? Like I don't understand the science any more than she does. I am just trusting of the science more than she is. Okay, so those are the contributions of perspective taking. I'll be a little briefer here because I think we're running a little low on time here on affect sharing. So what affect sharing does is, again, this is like coming to experience the emotions that the target experiences because they experience them. It reveals some affective common ground. So in the case of me and the anti-vaxxer mom, what I realize is that both of us in a scary world are trying to protect our children in the best way that we know possible, right? So underscoring these affective experiences and these values and these kind of emotional responses to an uncertain and scary world. It generates an emotional investment in the target. That is, I see this, I humanize this target, and I can kind of understand more about her, and I'm more invested in the decisions that she makes. And I think putting all this together, what this does is give us the crucial ingredients for trust. That is, opens us up to the possibility that maybe this person's motivations are actually pretty good. Maybe this person is competent in ways that I didn't appreciate before. I mean, I'm not going to put her in charge of administering vaccines, right? But I might think that she is trustworthy with respect to other things because I've gone through this process. Okay, so what I want to ask in closing here is whether empathy across these divides is even possible. So remember what Bailey was suggesting is that empathy across these divides is just bound to fail. And I gave a counter argument about the fragility of trust without understanding. I suggested that maybe we can capture the emotional appraisals in other people's affective experiences. But maybe she's right, after all, that maybe in fact empathy across these divides is bound to fail for a number of reasons. So is it possible truly to empathize across these divides? This is where I think empathizing with fictional characters is especially instructive. So I've already primed you with the example of empathizing with Othello. This is just one of many examples. Part of the joy of fiction is that we get to empathize, take on the perspectives and emotional experiences of people who are very different from us. Right? That's why we like fiction. I can't imagine enjoying a fiction about a philosophy professor's ordinary life. I can imagine that that would be interesting in any way whatsoever. So look, we don't always empathize with fictional characters. There are some fictional characters who are just not designed to be empathized with. Iago from Othello is kind of this way, right? There's just a block. It's just really impossible to kind of understand his perspective. So we don't always do this, but I think we often do. We often do imagine experiencing what they experience. Now, the case of fiction is perhaps a little bit different from the case of real characters in the sense that there may be no fact of the matter as to what a fictional character is experiencing if it's not explicit or even implied in the fiction. But I think there are clear cases where you can get it wrong or get it roughly right. So I don't think that that's a decisive objection. So what this is really is a proof of concept that we can in fact and do in fact and often in fact empathize with people who are very different from us in the case of fiction. So what does this show? I think the distinction that is relevant here is that in the case of real life people, so empathizing with the anti-vaxxer, and in the case of fictional characters, say Othello, you can empathize without endorsing what they are doing. You can capture the emotional appraisal by quarantining your own perspectives, but without, in the end of the day, endorsing their behavior, without endorsing their perspective as all things considered appropriate or fitting to the situation. I think what this reveals is that empathic accuracy is one question, but our empathic motivation is another. So my suspicion here is that the reason why we find it easy and in fact enjoyable to empathize with fictional characters has more to do with our motivations in receiving the fiction. We want to see other perspectives. We want to see what it's like from a different point of view. The stakes are higher with real life people. The stakes are higher in a context of political polarization. And it feels threatening in cases of real life people who are making real life decisions about whether to vaccinate their children that may or may not put your children at risk. In those cases, the stakes are higher. And so we are not open in the same way as we are in the case of fiction. So there's this really great research program by Jamil Zaki on motivated empathy. And what he does, I mean, the data is nothing new. It's kind of sort of culling from decades of data on empathy. but he has this kind of framework that I think is really helpful for understanding a lot of how empathy works. And he looks at the approach motivations and avoidance motivations that guide a lot of our empathic behavior. I won't go through all of this, but the kind of brief version of it is when we are looking to affiliate with people, when empathy is a socially desirable trait to exhibit, when we will benefit somehow from empathizing with other people, we tend to empathize, right? We have these motivations and regulatory strategies that implement these motivations, right? So we will literally lean in, we will pay attention, we will look at the eye region of the face, right? We will ask for details, we will, when we want to hear about a feel-good story, when our spouse or our friend has had something terrible happen, we want to empathize with them, and we do things to facilitate that. When we don't want to empathize with people, when it will be a bummer, right? Like, bring us down, it's just negative, like empathizing with somebody who is chronically depressed. When we stand to lose some competition for resources or some competition of values, this one's key, my perspective, then we will not empathize with people. And again, there are regulatory strategies that we will implement to avoid empathizing with people. So I think in the case of fiction, what we have is motivation to empathize because this is entertainment. And in the case of real life experiential differences, we have motivations to avoid empathizing. So really, I don't think this is an issue with the capacity for empathy itself. It's not an issue of empathic accuracy. It is in fact an issue of empathic. Okay, so what am I suggesting here? I'm not suggesting that there's an easy path forward, that you should all just go out and empathize with all the people in Indiana. But what I am suggesting is that empathy is a much better path forward here than trust. Because I don't think that trust is, leading with this trust first, as suggested by Olivia Bailey and Catherine Tolman, is going to work. One thing I haven't talked about, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, are cases where you should not, in fact, empathize, where you should refrain from empathizing in these cases. I think that is interesting and important to talk about the circumstances under which empathy is appropriate. But what I have tried to do here is suggest that aside from having those conditions available to us, if we want to break in through polarization and conflict, empathy first is a much better strategy than trust first. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to take our customary 3-minute break, and then we will reconvene for a discussion.
Oh, okay, you can decide, it would be too hard to
Adam,
judge
you
it.
can do it.
Yeah. All right,
Okay.
so
Jake,
Okay, hello, thank you for calling. So my question is about, I guess, what I want to call success conditions of empathy. It seemed possibly like your disagreement with, I think it was Bailey, has to do less with whether it's a matter of placing trust first or placing empathy first, and it has to do with you're having different standards of what counts as a successful attempt to empathize. It's where it seems like our view is places a higher bar, what counts as success in yours. So I guess my question is just sort of asking you to say more about what you think about sort of like what happens when someone attempts to empathize but fails, and sort of what is going on in that case and how that may differ from what
So good. So I would like to be on the same page as Bailey about the success conditions for empathy. The part that she thinks fails and the part that I think doesn't have to fail and often doesn't fail is capturing the emotional appraisal of somebody's affective experience. I think we can do that, and the proof of concept is the fiction case, but I don't think it's the only case. There's lots of empirical data out there kind of indicating cases where people actually approximate this. So there is, though, a disagreement about the success conditions with Tolman. So Tolman has a different reason for being suspicious of empathy's capacity here. So she is looking at, so Peter Goldie has this idea that we can never truly imagine, we can never do this kind of imagined self experience. So yes, so we can never really imagine ourselves in somebody else's situation because there's just this warping that happens that warps the imagination. It'll never truly be accurate. We can't imagine, I can't imagine myself, I don't know, being a physics major or something like, or imagine myself being you or somebody else. There's just this warping that happens. So what Tolman does is she takes that and applies it to imagining others. And so she thinks that it's just impossible, right? Not just factually difficult or, the track record isn't great. So she thinks it's actually impossible to accurately imagine others. And I think the standard that she has is kind of perfectly mapping the mental states you're attributing and the emotions and what the emotions feel like. And I think that bar just can't be met. It's almost by definition that bar can't be met. So I do want to agree with Bailey's stipulation of the success conditions, but disagree with Tolman's in that sense.
Hi, so I have a question about the use of the fictional characters case as proof of empathizing with people vastly different from us. I was wondering what you think about the idea that maybe we can empathize with fictional characters in this way because we have a special kind of access to them and their lives that we don't have to people in real life. Like we hear their thoughts, we see flashbacks to the tragic backstory. And we can't necessarily get that kind of access with others in real life. So what does that mean for this being proof?
Good. So I think that is in fact a typical difference, but it is not a necessary difference. So imagine the sort of fiction that you read, right? So novels. We can read somebody's diary, right? We can read the thoughts that they write down, the descriptions of their experiences, and get this kind of intimate access to them. So I think that there are cases where what explains the difference in our ability to empathize is the amount and quality of information we're getting about their experiences. I don't think that is the central difference, actually. Because I can imagine reading the diary of, say, a white supremacist and finding myself completely alienated in reading this. And even were it turned into a movie, finding myself completely alienated from this. So I think you're right to point out the differences sometimes between fiction and real life people, but I don't think that is the crucial difference that explains our willingness to empathize in the case of fiction.
Yeah, I was wondering about the conditions that need to be met in order to empathize with a person. My idea, I'm inclined to say that, trust is a necessary condition for one to empathize with a person, if I distrust a person to the point where I won't even allow them near me, say, it's hard for me to empathize with that person then, wouldn't it? Or in another case, if I don't trust that a person is using English in the same way that I'm using English, hard for me to maybe take what they're saying seriously and further empathize with, the emotions they might be expressing to me. How would you do, or how would you respond?
Yeah, good. So I'll give kind of the kind of short version and then maybe fill in some details. So the short version is that I think empathizing with somebody you distrust is difficult, but trusting somebody you can empathize with is impossible. At least that's my takeaway. Because you cannot build up the beliefs about their epistemic competence or the beliefs about their motivations without, because of the distrust, the way in is going to be through empathy. So I think that you're absolutely right. It is difficult. But it speaks to the motivations that are preventing somebody from engaging because they distrust. Oh, that's totally satisfying to you. What I'm motivated here by, what I'm moved by, are some of these really interesting empirical studies looking at real life conflicts, right? The Israeli-Palestine conflict, white Arizonans and Mexican immigrants living in Arizona, right? These sorts of cases. There's this interesting study by Emil Bruno and Rebecca Sachs on perspective taking and perspective giving. And like these sorts of cases where there just is this kind of standing suspicion or distrust or dislike, and the sorts of interventions that help in those sorts of cases are empathy interventions. So the fiction case, right, is a proof of concept, but I think that there are actually some studies out there to suggest that there are ways to put a crack in.
Sure.
So I was really interested in like your point at the end, that or suggestion at the end, that it's not that we can't empathize in many of these cases of affective motivations. We can all too well. We sort of dread the consequences and harden our hearts against it in order to fully enter into elaborate. So I wonder then what you think about the possibility of opportunities for small positive cooperation as that way in. If I think, it's it's me or the NIMBY, then it's dreadful to enter into their perspective, because what if I go all the way and then I'm like, yes, I should sacrifice millions of dollars of lifetime income so you don't have to see a tall house.
Yeah.
Right? It's convinced me. I can finish this on court, right?
Yeah.
And so, then I harden my heart against them, and they can see like, oh, this person like clearly is not like taking my legitimate concern is right. And so maybe the lack of like confidence in some positive, option for like, hey, it's safe to empathize. Like you can empathize without sacrificing I wonder if you think that could help. It seems like And presumably there are things that, with the law makers, like, not double paying for healthcare or something like that, that
Right,
we all feel passionately about it.
right,
You know, or if you say trust and empathy were very high at the end of World War II, right, that would be another case, right? So empathy is associated with affiliation, like creating situations where like, look, this could benefit you a
mhm,
lot in a very concrete way.
right,
Um,
right,
Hooking up the carpool when car costs are, you know, 7K, or,
yeah,
you know, finding like a, you know, fair, you know, way for building benefit local, you know, the areas that are sacrificing, I don't know, yeah, so.
yeah, 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 yeah. So Hannah Reed, has a couple of really great papers on, this idea of like when and how, building empathy is good, and is helpful, and she has this, a few kind of like anecdotes, but then gives this sort of analysis of like when building, there's not quite hostile collaborations, but they're kind of like hostile collaborations in science where you have these two people from different perspectives, but they have a shared goal, right? Like they want to make the school board functional, right? They want to, you know, like raise money for the school board, but they just have really different, you know, perspectives and backgrounds and values and stuff. In those sorts of cases, they can be really powerful, small scale interventions where you get somebody to kind of recognize the common ground that is shared, and then like you really do shift perspectives, shift mindset.
Matthew? Oh, sorry, Matthew Hoffman.
So. I don't know, I think I don't exactly buy the notion of affect sharing here, but I want to continue questions about fiction. In particular, it seems like your examples of fiction, and maybe you're just going to say this is the example of the better examples, but it seems like what's going on is perspective taking. It's about the character's point of view, not so much the affect. So when I watch Othello, I'm not feeling angry when he's angry, in part because of the dramatic irony.
Right.
But I don't know, I think that generalizes to what we're doing with fiction. It's primarily about the perspective taking, not about affectively sharing what the character is feeling at time T.
Yeah, I disagree. So I think that we can kind of titrate between different perspectives, of course, and in some fictions, there's a narrator who kind of reveals all to us, and we have really different perspectives. But think about just Romeo and Juliet, right? And the heartbreak that they experience, even though we know, you know, the real situation. I think what many of us, most of us probably, how we experience reading Romeo and Juliet is to experience this desperation and sadness. I think that may not be every, like the, you know, through a, you know, a 3-hour play, like that's not the kind of experience that tracks for every second of it. But I think we are doing that, it's experiencing these emotions that they are experiencing.
So I can just rotate me, keep rotating the records I want, but I want to start with a kind of two-part question, a worry about, I characterize as a worry about salience and perniciousness. And the difference between your starting points and Olivia Bailey's. So salience, it may be that you can, in the case of the anti-vaxxer mother, appreciate that, and in some sense, a very generalized sense, feel that she's a person who cares about the child. But what we're talking about in political polarization is a specifically political matter. And I worry that that case is like, Ali Sheik, the actor. No, Breakfast Club.
Oh, yes.
Ali Sheik. When she was
Okay, but still no. Sorry.
so low.
No. I mean, I know the reference stuff, but I don't know.
The basket case of Breakfast Club. when she was 12 years old, she wrote a book. The book published it, so got it, called She Was Nice to Mice. And it's about Queen Elizabeth I, who was apparently an awful person, but nice to mice. And I worry that the I love my kids thing is with respect to the political sphere like that. Okay, but it's not relevant for what has to get done if the political polarization is to be brought down and should be brought down. The question about whether it should be brought down is a further question. My own view is that in the real facts on the ground today, most of the political polarization is about dehumanization and shouldn't. But then there's the perniciousness thing, which is the difference. The perniciousness worry is that it seems to me it would be really easy for Olivia Bailey or someone like her to say, look, insofar as you've given an example of a case where you can empathize in whatever the relevant are, those aren't the relevant cases. And the worry is that it's politically pernicious to start with the assumption in the cases that we want to have some kind of communication, some kind of, as some of us call it, emotional attunement. It's pernicious to assume that you can cross that experiential line because it's a kind of hubris, right? It's a kind of hubris that an example in a joint with the article that I have it's the kind of hubris that Black people react to when Black people say, they say, oh, I was followed in the grocery store. And the white person says, oh yeah, I'm scared of cops. I know what that's like. And we can download. And I worry that the presumption of being able to do this is politically pernicious. It's going to make the polarization that we want to solve worse.
Yes, so that's Bailey's fear. I think that fear is met with intellectual humility, right? So not the assumption that you're going to get it right on the first try, but with curiosity, with asking questions about somebody's experience. And the reason why I think that's the way to go is that the other path just seems impossible. And so I think I have a similar thing to say about the salience worry as well. And part of what you were suggesting there is like, okay, this woman loves her kids, but really what we want is a critical mass of the population vaccinated. So who really cares if she loves her kids? And I guess what I'd like to say is that like, you're never going to win people over dismissing them.
But it doesn't follow from that the empathy is what makes them over either. Right, it just doesn't, it doesn't follow.
Right, so it's not, the empathy doesn't win them over. What the empathy does is reveal the points at which it's effective to communicate on, right? The ways in which you can actually have a productive conversation. Or like so the example I gave was, my suggestion to the anti-vax mother was like, well, read this paper and read that paper and read that paper. Or I can't believe you're trusting this Facebook group as opposed to a search in general, what have you. That's going to be completely ineffective. And so I think the more effective response is to understand where she's coming from and speak in that language to her, which doesn't guarantee success, of course, like none of this does, but I think that's much more effective.
Antonio?
Yeah, thank you for your thought. I have a question about a kind of different situation from the one, this other situation you described. So you described an experience gap and someone who you're not sure you understand, and you have to trust or empathize with them. And you suggesting that empathy is a good path. What about if you're actually the one who is not trusted, or you're not the one you're not understanding, you're not understood? At that point, you may have. It's a good, that's why I want to ask about this other situation. My impression at least seems that in that case, if I can do something, is to elicit trust instead of empathy. So instead of appealing to the personal empathy, I can show I am trustworthy in some sense. So at least in this direction, seems to me to more effective if I try to play on trust and show that I'm trustworthy with respect to many things. And that may win over a little bit more. While in the other direction, since I agree with you with like empathy. Yeah. Right. So yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, I think in that sort of case, what's important to ask is whether this imaginative person distrusts you or just simply you have no track record for them. If it's the latter, then I think you're right? So being consistent and having a good track record is the way forward there. But if they distrust you, I don't know what else you could do, honestly, because the track record, because of the way in which confirmation bias is built into distrusting people, especially kind of distrusting their motivations, I don't know how you can get them to trust you.
There were two follow-ups to this. First, Garrett.
Yeah, so this is also was going to be my question. What Antonio said setup. So it seems to me, I think you would agree that when we're trying to empathize in your sense, it's a kind of process, right? There's a beginning point, it gets deeper, it works successful. And I'm thinking, or I want to suggest that at each stage, there has to be some trust as well. So the woman you're speaking with, trust that she's open to you about her feelings. She's showing you something. And I think that is the kind of trust that could be betrayed and later realize it's all a show or something of betrayal. And that it's on the basis of something, some kind of minimal trust about what she shows you, what she says or does, that you can come to understand and have the empathy that you're saying you develop. And then that can maybe allow for another step of the new kind of trust in something she says or does. I'm just wondering if there really is a way to separate these in the way you're suggesting, especially since trust, we say, is a three-place thing of a person in a certain respect. So why couldn't it be a bunch of different steps of ever-changing kinds of trust coinciding with opportunities for similarly changing types of things as you work your way in. And it seems to me that that's true to the phenomenology of it.
Yeah, so your idea is that they kind of scaffold
Yeah.
each other. Yeah, so you build a bit, you maybe empathize and build a bit of trust, and then you kind of like build up from there. That seems true to the phenomenology of it for me as well. Right, so I think this is probably a dynamic process, especially if this is an iterative process. Or in the case where you're kind of working in this collaboration with somebody. What you get at the very beginning is incredibly minimal.
Yeah, really sure. So you speak of distrust and confirmation bias, but your own setup for trust seems to say something that's true, which is that when you trust someone, you also have a kind of confirmation bias. You use that phrase, right? So neither one of them seems to be more resistant to counter evidence than the other.
Good. So I think I didn't quite put it this way. But what I wanted to suggest is that like with a bad enough case, you can go from trusting to distrusting somebody, right? So somebody could violate your trust so badly that it is just absolutely clear. We can't get that one fell swoop with trusting. Or sorry, with distrust. Yeah. Right. So so I should say that it's not clear to me that this asymmetry, many folks think there is this asymmetry between trust and distrust, but at least in this respect, I think that there is.
I want to interrupt for just a moment. For the folks who are on Zoom, I want to say explicitly, if you have a question, please type it into the chat and Oliver will convey it to us here. Okay, Kirk.
Just a little bit of a follow-up on Lincoln's question. I think about the role of empathy. So So when you characterize trust, it was a matter of having information about someone's confidence, someone's motivations. And so it looks like the role of empathy is giving information, provide that information about the confidence, information for life, the motivation.
Right.
But now trust is this three-place relation. And it seems to me that getting information is not per se that we trust someone. That's not their motivation. May confirm for you that they're going to involve do things which are things that you think would be bad. And taking the case of policy decisions, sometimes political education, see. We're concerned about policy with respect to vaccinations or abortion or whatever the issue is. Information death may lead to distrust or to decisions about the relevant thing. So I was wondering now, is the way you want to think about empathy not that what it does is lead you to trust the person about this or that thing, but rather this other thing you were sort of emphasizing at this point, which is, well, backing away from the three-place relation and particular issues, is there a way to find common ground to keep which more constructive dialogue like that, puts it in a slightly different light. So anyway, that's the
Yeah, good. In the paper version, which is very much in flux at this point, I have a line about empathy sometimes revealing that people are just as wicked or foolish as they seem to be on surface. It is totally possible that could happen. That could happen to me. So yeah, it doesn't lead directly to trust. What I think I would suggest is what you were saying, that it leads us to beliefs about somebody's motivations, and beliefs about perhaps what they care about, like what's kind of, and the perspective taking part. It's like, what beliefs, what values, what desires are motivating their behavior. And I think knowing that is helpful for developing beliefs about their motivations, which could lead us to trust them, right? Depending. Well, I mean, we're still at the abstract level, right? So.
Not about vaccinations.
Right.
Not about, let's say, abortion. Not
Okay.
about immigration policy.
Right.
Not about policy.
Right.
There are lots of things where you understand motivation.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
I really can't trust them.
Right. So epistemically trust them, right? So so remember the distinction between pragmatic trust and epistemic trust. So what's most relevant here is the epistemic trust, right? Trusting their evaluations of things, or trusting their judgments on things. And this might, in the vaccination case, this is tied to a particular pragmatic behavior. So this is a little bit of a tricky case, but like imagine we're having this debate about abortion, right? I might say like, well, there's somebody who has this really different perspective, like a radically different perspective from me. And I just don't understand like how this person could have this perspective.
But I do. I think they're wrong. It's not that I understand, it's that they're wrong.
I mean, sure, that could be the case. I was trying to give an example, right?
Look, if I thought, the zygote were a person,
Right.
then I'd be on board.
Right.
And I understand why they say it's wrong.
Fair enough about that particular case. So what I want to suggest is what you get out of empathizing is this belief about their motivations, and how that leads to trust is not direct, right? You might not particularly trust them to do a particular thing on the basis of that, but I might think like, I trust them, if I had to have them babysit my kids. Sure, I think that they would, not like they're gonna Nancy Baxter watch your kids?
No.
My word. I'm sure that there are lots of them around, and they're probably already watching your kids. But in any case, the kind of sum up of the answer is that it doesn't directly lead to trust, right? Right? This is not a kind of direct causal relation. It opens the ground for trust in a way that other methods don't, is what I'm going to suggest.
Zoe.
So I think at one point you mentioned that you could talk more about when we should not be empathizing, and I'm interested in that. In particular, I'm thinking of these sorts of projects where two people with very different opinions and worldviews are paired together to understand that they're both real people and have a conversation, whatever. I think it's typically, though, not people with differing opinions on vaccination policy. It's often someone who has one or more marginalized identities and somebody who hates them just because of that. And I'm wondering, ought the person in the more vulnerable position there approach that with empathy? That doesn't feel quite like a safe or correct option there.
Yeah, good. So I mentioned the Hannah Reid's papers on this, and this is one of these cases where empathizing might cause you harm, right? I think this is especially the case when there are structural power imbalances at play, because how the empathy tends to go is not a productive route. So the person in the power situation at the position of authority tends not to truly or really empathize with the other person, and kind of downward to upward empathy doesn't seem to accomplish much. So I think in cases where empathizing with somebody will cause you harm is obviously not something to do. So Fritz Bright here as examples of empathy in these sorts of circumstances that where the dark sides of empathy, where empathy leads to some pretty problematic behaviors as well. These are other sorts of cases, right? Like stalking, or like helicopter parenting, sorts of cases where it seems like a misuse of empathy.
Oh, thank you for your thought. I think actually my question is also about cut from the same thought as cuts, but let me try and put it a little differently. So in the sense of it seems as if you motivated this importance of empathy by saying, I don't know misunderstanding, by saying that what's really bad, we don't have empathy if we get things like polarization. And you're sort of saying that empathy is a sort of this sort of stage between that. And I was what is a sort of necessary part of polarization.
So I think there's multiple paths to polarization. I want to be clear about that. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe my question is confused. I guess I'm just I think there's quite a lot of modes of polarization that wouldn't involve empathy.
Absolutely.
And thus, I'm not sure we're always trying to empathize what would be the best solution.
Right. So one of the things I said at the top that might speak to this is that the propaganda and kind of exploiting and manipulated news or other sources of information clearly is a source of polarization or a cause of polarization. I think how and you know, like empathizing doesn't solve those sorts of informational problems. I think that there's numerous sources of polarization.
But I wonder even if polarization could be a much more mundane phenomenon than people screwing between forms of propaganda where people just want to signal to their in-group, or they're working in a sort of epistemic bubble. And that sort of seems a little bit different from the dynamic. And so I wonder how, I guess there are different components of creating questions, but I suppose I wonder at least if you want to zoom out to these more macro political phenomena, how might that really going to be involved in many of the court cases, whether they're going to be better mediated routes available to us.
Good, yeah, so I don't think that this is the tool for every problem, or every version of this problem, or every cause of this problem. So I don't want to oversell what I'm suggesting here. In the kind of narrow universe that I'm discussing here, there are kind of two potential roads in, but not the only two roads in, and like all things considered, right? So I was considering the kind of trust first versus empathy first kind of paths, but I want to be clear that empathy can't solve every problem. The wider we scale out to causes of the polarization, the more generic I think any one response is going to be.
I have a question about was it Bailey that just trust without empathizing? And I was a little puzzled by the example, which was, I think, that guy gave me, or that person gave me a aggressive stare or something. And what is it, so with that example, to start with that, what is it that she's saying we should trust? Like, should we trust that she felt frightened or aggrieved by, or that the person really did have some aggressive expression on his face? It's the latter of those?
It's the latter, absolutely. So
Okay.
she thinks it's not really trust if you're saying, well, I trust that you feel that way.
Yeah,
Right? That's what
okay.
a bad therapist is.
So if this is a case where I saw, now maybe I misunderstood, that I saw the expression on the person's face and it just didn't look aggressive to me, the idea would be that I should trust that she is better at reading facial expressions than I am, or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. So and what are the conditions under which he thinks we should trust like that? When, you know, if I can see evidence and somebody else is coming to a different conclusion based on the same evidence, what again is it that I think we shouldn't always trust someone in a situation like that? Or what's the context of this?
The context is when you're not in a good position to judge the authentic nature of their experience.
Okay. All right, so if we, could you give like a political example of like a political disagreement or something like that? That would be like this? Because it seems like it would be one where the only way it makes sense for me to go into trusting this person who has a different view of me is if I think that they are, if I antecedently think they are more knowledgeable than me or more something than in a better epistemic position than I am. Is that
Right.
the idea?
So she's focused on these experiences more than political disagreements, right? So trying to understand somebody's lived experiences. And I think that gives her case more plausibility.
All right.
Follow-ups. Clara, did you have your hand up for a question, or was it a follow-up to this particular?
I'm a little curious about what you meant by epistemic vigilance mechanisms.
Good. So Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber have done a lot of work on this. So they're taking it from kind of evolutionary perspective, looking at animals and then all the way on up to humans for these mechanisms that are in place to discriminate good mates from bad mates, the behaviors that indicate health or lack of health, on up to kind of human. So some of it starts off as like studying behavior of antelopes. up to humans, right, it is like kind of intonations, ways of talking, eye contact, right, these sorts of things. Where we can tell in a face-to-face interaction pretty quickly, usually, these are kind of split second is the right word, but very rapid judgments about whether somebody is telling the truth, and we can often do it without even listening to what they're saying. So these sorts of mechanisms that they argue have evolved in humans over time to discriminate, you know, basically truth from falsity. Actually, they don't think it's truth from falsity. They think it's something else, but we can get into that.
And in that instance, that comes to you realizing trust and then moves on to empathy.
It's a little too quick. So many steps in between there. So the epistemic vigilance mechanisms are ones that when they're working well can tell us, you know, when to be wary, right? When to be suspicious, right? And then the connection to empathy and trust is a bit more distinct.
So we still have a number of people in the queue and only a few more minutes, so I'm gonna put a moratorium on follow-ups. I apologize for that, but I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to ask the question you wanted to ask. David?
Yes, I'm sorry, I got stuck fairly early. With
No.
that happens a lot. With the two senses, I thought there were two senses of trust, and I wasn't quite sure. There was a distinction between the trust that when defeated produces a sense of betrayal, and the trust that produces merely a sense of disappointment or surprise. Was it only the latter you were discussing?
So I distinguish between trust and reliance.
Yes.
And reliance is the sort of thing that can be disappointed, whereas trust is the sort of thing that can be betrayed. So I was trying to focus on trust.
Okay, so the betrayal notion is the vocal notion here. Because the discussion after that has sounded much more like it's using the reliance notion. I take it if we're thinking about empathy with an eye to what may or may not involve betrayal, this is involving a kind of fairly substantial interpersonal space, expectations. That could be political, right? I mean, it can hold politically. But that would seem to involve a different kind of empathy, more robust empathy, and something that involves a kind of ongoing negotiation. Then, sorry, it sounds like the discussion of empathy and the discussion of trust is key, and that seems to be coming out in shape. Or more towards, you know, again, assessment of competence. Assessment of competence is, I think, maybe notion of betrayal or seems to be very far apart. So I'm sorry, which are there really two things going on here?
No, so I do want to focus on trust with the possibility of betrayal. For numerous reasons, though I think, you know, reliance is perhaps a middle ground where what you get yourself to do is, you know, rely upon somebody without actually trusting them. The reason why I think trust is particularly interesting here in connection to empathy is that empathy can kind of lead you to that space where you could be betrayed, right? That emotional investment that you get in virtue of empathy, I think is what opens the space for.
Sorry, I'll just say quickly, that seems like a different exercise though. But in this case, and maybe this is why it's what this is talking about. That seems to be like trying to suss out the character and limits of a relationship, implicit expectations. You know, that's different than a kind of assessment that a third person. And the sense of empathy would seem to be different. Those things are
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm with you on that. So I think you're right, though, in the suggestion that this kind of intervention is not the sort like you go to like an empathy workshop and then all the problems in your department are solved. Not quite like that. Like this really is like a kind of interpersonal, like one-on-one sort of relationship or collaborative relationship that is very right, and then I think scaffolds and the way that.
Thank you for your talk. I think I like the picture of empathy first, actually, with you, from better or worse, apparently. But I like that picture a bit, but I think the questions do bring out something that is very risky to that picture, because even if we accept the scaffold picture, I get off the ground with the vaccine mom, in terms of her being a mother. I'm not yet empathetic with her on her stance of vaccine, and but I treat her as someone in my realm of fellow dignified beings who I have some kind of, I should treat their agency as mattering, but I'm not going to trust them in this political spirit. So if I have that initial scaffold, if I'm going to follow this account and get to the political spirit, seems like empathy first means I have to actually be willing to treat her particular views about vaccines and the beliefs that scaffold, the background beliefs, those background values, as things I could entertain, which is very risky of me for a subject, I guess. So I guess in order to get to the right kind of empathy leads to trust, it seems like at every instance in which it would count, it needs to be a particular instance for the particular beliefs, which is why I think there's a lot of, like, we want to resist that because I don't want to take on that mindset. I don't want to, but I agree with you that in order for discourse to get involved, actually, we might need to be that risky. So I guess, do you feel like your account also, like, it's actually a very demanding account, because we're not, like, it's not a fiction, there's no fictional second order relationship. It's me, it's my agency, it's my values that I'm putting on the line. If I in any way hedged on it, I wouldn't actually be empathetic then. I'd be using ulterior motives to get them to agree with me. So you kind of get what I'm saying,
I do. So, I mean, I just think about, like, when I'm engaging with somebody, like students, for example, who have just radically different perspectives, in part because they're just wrong about things, right? Or misinformed, or what is it? Like, I can engage with them by, like, quarantining my own perspective, like engage with them on their terms and get them to kind of, I don't know, not be so confident in their own views because I'm engaging with them on their own terms. And it doesn't threaten my own perspective because I'm trying to talk, with them, right?
would you count that as empathy though? Because in my view, that doesn't sound like empathy. That sounds like something, I guess, a little bit different. Because empathy requires me actually being effectively involved, where if I have this distant stance, it doesn't seem like it's the same thing.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is I'm quarantining my own kind of stance.
And that counts as empathy?
No, that's part of it, right? Right. And in empathizing, you need to quarantine your own experiences in order to kind of take on the perspective and experiences of somebody else. Or if these terms don't, kind of resonate with you, like the mental simulation literature, right? Simulation, like part of what you're doing in understanding other people is quarantining your own beliefs, desires, and et cetera, in order to predict and explain what somebody else is going to do. It's that quarantining process that I think is going on there that we can do in real life.
I think we have one last question. Fritz?
I should get the last question. Thank you. I tried to make it short. Thank you, Shannon. I enjoyed this a lot, and your ways to bring clarity in a lot of relationships is wonderful. I learned a lot. I want to make it short. I make a comment and one a question. The first one I just wanted to comment. I don't like the word to empathize very much, and I use it too. So don't worry. I think mostly the examples you gave when you used that word were theory of mind perspective taking focus. We take the perspective of a character, often in fiction. I like that discussion in that regard. And usually in regard to this very specific situation, a clear situation, we understand what's better in that situation. But that doesn't spill over to warm fuzzy feelings necessarily. And that's one kind of situation. I understand that.
Yeah.
A very different form. So I would rather say perspective taking. Then we can also share feelings. That's very different. I see my friend Sarah as a certain emotion, and I figure out what the situation is later. I mean, I will be on her side and feel that too. But then there's a third one, which is co-experience. And you came to that at the very end. Where we go through something, It can be accurate or inaccurately, but we have the human subjectivity that we share experience. I would actually be careful to use the word empathize, because we're really doing different things, and there's more forms. My question is now coming back to, and this, I follow Gary's suggestion and building on Antonio, you also got these, putting these things together in stages. I like that. I like also to try that. My question is then again to the question of polarization and empathy, which I think is indeed a very important and very central question, but there's many sides that has come out here. My standard thought at this point now as a blanket statement is to say, if you want to get over polarization, the first thing is you need to take out empathy. And so that's where we seem to disagree. It's the reason for my stand is that in the moment that you have some kind of conflict, most people, and I often talk about third people, but everyone is also an observer of the conflict, tends to see things through one or the other perspective. It's very hard. We, as human beings, we cannot easily get out of having one perspective. We have one perspective. People can try to jump back and forth on facility, that's hard. And then people stay stuck in that perspective and slowly develop affect sharing and start to evaluate the other side, become one-sided. So I like a lot of these approaches where say we'll take empathy out and either build common ground or try to have rational approaches or all that. Now you say there is a way for empathy to walk in polarization. You said at the end, you say empathy is better than trust.
Good.
Explain.
Good. So I will rehearse the why not trust first, and I will.
I buy that.
Yes. I will also say that there are many different proposed solutions from political scientists and sociologists and psychologists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think what you do when you're doing these collaborations is you're building empathy, right? And these interventions where you get people who have these different perspectives to work together on a school board or at city hall, right? What you're really facilitating there is empathy. And maybe that's not scalable, right? Maybe that's not the sort of thing that we can do, at the population level, but in the small community level, I think we can do these interventions and have, at least my take on it, the reason why they work is that you are facilitating empathy.
So the strategy we would propose, is to basically find in a community you feel notice, oh, we actually are all human beings, we are all good mothers or parents and care for this and that. And then therefore the polarization issue in a way becomes a little bit diminished, whatever is holding us apart. Now, when we have situations like Gaza right now, this is of course a very complicated matter here, but that seems to be very hard for Northern Ireland. It seems to be very hard to use that approach, except if you are in a small community in a situation where peace is there. So we can first say, oh, let's first build common ground, and the polarizing thing that will disappear something.
Well, I mean, first you have to stop bombing people, right? I think that's probably the first strategy. Right. And then you have to rebuild, right? There are like some basic human needs that I think in these situations have got to be met before there's any possibility of addressing polarization. I mean, like polarization doesn't quite capture what's going on in the situations before. But I do want to suggest that empathy is not the only or most effective tool for every problem where you have people who are divided.
So in a moment, we will continue the conversation in the next room. I hope you will join us for the reception. I wanted to again thank the Clark family for their generosity. I wanted to acknowledge Sally Letzinger, who's joined us today. And I would like to again thank Shannon for a talk that has stimulated a very interesting and productive conversation. Thank you.